Welcome back, everybody. The Super M has had a few days to dry, so the paint is not quite so delicate anymore. You can actually touch this thing and do some work and get a few pieces on. So some pieces I've hung on already. The drawbar brackets that I had painted, I have those on both sides, and you can see there is some touch-up that has to be done once you've ground these threads upon each other. It usually takes the paint off of those areas, but the hex portions of the pre-painted nuts and bolts hold up pretty well. A little bit of dingage on the corners there, but a small little touch-up brush with some pre-mixed paint will get all that stuff looking good once again. So we'll come over here. You can see I've got brake pedals on, clutch pedals on, assembled all that stuff to the cross shaft. You can see the clutch pedal was tightened up considerably after I rebushed it. If you remember, we had that carriage bolt that was bent through this hole coming out to act as a guide to get that clutch pedal back onto its stop on the top cover. No need to worry about that anymore. Down here, down here, the light is pretty poor out here. It's not as good as it is back there. New rubber brake boots on the pull rods where they go into each brake housing. You can see we've got one over here on this side too. Like I said, pedals are all installed. We're adjusted up properly. They want 1 1/8 to 1 3/8 free play travel up here as measured at each pedal. We're good to go right there. Have the brake lock put in. You can see the cotter pin is still in the raw. That's something that I always touch up later. Cotter pins are pretty tough to keep paint on anyway. When you put them in a hole and you start bending, the new paint usually cracks off anyway. So I put them in raw, go ahead and touch them up manually later. Other little touch-up spots like this flip lever right here. Get that out of the shadow of the camera. When I painted it, because these pedals are hanging upside down, it was up like that. So we got some raw edges on each side of the pivot. They're gonna have to be touched up later. No big deal. And first thing I did, I got a little ahead of myself here. The first thing I did was put this belt pulley drive back on because it's so awkward the way it has to sit. And one thing to remember right there, make sure this upper bell housing bolt is in place before you put that drive on. Otherwise, it doesn't afford you enough room to get it put into its hole. So what we're doing today now is assembling the input coupling, input shaft, throw-out bearing, all that stuff in the bell housing, getting ready to hang the engine on. But first things first, before we assemble the input shaft into the bell housing, it doubles as the perfect clutch alignment tool for hanging the new clutch disc and pressure plate on. So new disc and new plate is in place, everything's torqued down. The lockout cage bolts are removed, full tension is once again applied to the clutch disc. That input shaft could not double as a better tool. I had a couple people ask me in the comment section if I was going to build a tool for this. Not if I can get by with using this piece before I go ahead and put it in the bell housing. So that's pretty much ready to go in. So we'll come over here. I want to show you some of the coupling pieces which attaches this input shaft to the input yoke in the transmission. We have this square coupling piece here, has all the offsets. 2 of the holes align with 2 of the ears on the shaft. The other 2 holes align with the ears on the input. You want to look at these for being wallowed out and egg shaped. These have a little bit of wear, but they are not bad. But the bolts that go through, you can see there is a taper on each one that is a taper fit into all 4 of those holes in those yokes between the shaft and the input, and we had a lot of wear on here from where they ran on that square coupling, as well as the rubber insulators and the backup sleeves for them. This is fairly representative of what you usually find in these things. This rubber is hardened up, it's collapsed, and the retainer, the metal backing, is all deteriorated. So you can see that one's a little bit better condition, but still the rubber is not good at all. But fortunately, they still sell all those pieces brand new now that I messed up my perfect little lineup. All right, hang on. There, eyelid won't twitch anymore. They're all in a row. You can get brand new steel backings, brand new rubber pucks, which are a lot thicker than those old worn and collapsed ones, and new bolt kits where you have the taper, it's all proper diameter, come with a new lock washer, new nut. So you need 4 bolts to do one tractor, and you need 8 of the retainers and 8 of the rubber pucks to go all the way around that coupling piece. So now that everyone's caught up on what's been happening, I'm going to start throwing those pieces into the bell housing. I'm trying to get the engine hung on to the back end today, and I'd like to shoot for a few more pieces as well. I'll assemble this one connection right here just to give you guys a better view in case you're unclear on it at all. You can see the rubber pucks are just an insulator between the coupling, the yoke, and the head of the bolt. So that taper on the bolt will seat into the corresponding taper in that yoke. Draw the nuts down tight, which I won't do on camera here, but once they're properly tightened, that just gives you a rather, well, I shouldn't call it a rigid coupling, but it is an isolated coupling so that any kind of vibrations, whatever, aren't transmitted right through, and it keeps the wear down because you're not running metal on metal from the coupling to either yoke. So we'll just use the other two bolts with insulators to assemble this to the input yoke and the transmission, and that's all it takes to install it. Alright, input shaft is installed, so the next piece that goes in is the housing or guide for the clutch release bearing. Everything's tight here, so the next piece that goes in is the clutch release bearing. Now, this is the original IH stamped bearing that was in this tractor when we took it apart. We bought a new replacement, which is not IH, factory, but it's what is available for it. And I installed this onto that little housing, and I found this is the little relief hole that they put in that race to let grease get in and lubricate this bearing. The problem I had is when I put the new one on, this hole is not cut deep enough into this center area here to align with the grease passage that's in the piece that it goes on, and this would not last very long without being able to periodically grease it. So the options at hand were, since it's way too difficult to try and modify this without getting swarf and grit and everything else into the bearing, would be to modify this housing to make that grease passage come in just a little bit, or out, sorry, just a little bit further and align with that relief. Or I really scrutinized the original throwout bearing and I couldn't find anything wrong with it at all. So the path I chose to take, right, wrong, or otherwise, was to put the original IH factory one back on. Part of the reason why that really doesn't bother me that much is because should this ever go bad, I can replace it without splitting the tractor by accessing it through this area down here. All this stuff can just be disassembled. I can change that bearing out probably 30 minutes to an hour later. It's all back in and we're good to go again. So that's what I chose to do. A little bit of a layer of grease on the guide and a little bit of layer of grease in there. So we'll just slide this on just like that. Make sure that everything moves freely, and it does. So we need to make sure that the grease tube is pointed out this way because that's the access hole right there to get at it to grease it from the outside. Release fork can go in now, engage it with the tabs on each side of that throwout bearing housing, and we'll guide the shaft through it. Alright, tighten down the bolts that pinch the fork onto the shaft. We're just testing the movement of everything. It's all good. Another thing I put on was that return spring for the release bearing. I didn't think I needed to show that on camera. The other piece I put on off camera was this little spring-loaded access cover right here. That is what plugs the hole for you to get in and put grease into that release bearing. Pretty simple install. There's just a little spring flat washer and a cotter pin. holds that thing where it needs to be. So we should be finished inside the bell housing here. Next up, we're going to tool up to hang the engine. Go a little more yet. Okay, that's going to put us pretty close. Just creep in with it and see where we're at. Let me take a look here. Let's just stop.
From here, the holes look good.
It's looking pretty good. Let's creep it in some more. Okay, hold up.
Go in.
Tell you what, up just a skosh.
Oh.
Yep, just a little bit. Okay.
Should go in?
Yep. That freed it up quite a bit. Okay, splines are started in the clutch disc. And we might actually have to come down just, a tad bit. Just go easy on her.
I'll try.
Yep, right there. Get a couple of those 3/4 bolts off the cable side.
Hold it up. Okay.
Should be home.
That dog went pretty good over there.
Yeah, we're fully seated here. I'll just make sure. Yep. All right, so the engine's on. Everything's in place. Went pretty well. Everything slid right in. Gosh, like I said, the light out here is horrible. I need to get some good LEDs hanging up like I got back there. But good enough to get the job done so far. Masking is removed for some of the water components on the front. Masking is removed for oil filter base on this side. There are a few bolt-on items we want to get on the engine on this side before we start putting those side channels on. Once we can get that done, side channels can go on, we can start doing bolster and then front axle, and then hopefully get another 2 wheels on the ground up here, and we'll have a roller. So that's going to do it for this episode. I think we're at a good point to break away right now. Kind of a lot of detail work that had to happen in that bell housing, but it all had to be done before the engine got put on and capped all that off. So that's another edition. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hope to see you back again.